What's good, everyone? Tweeby's back with another video. In this video, I'll be going through another series, as I did with High School HD, except this one is going to be Avatar: The Last Airbender. I'll be going through a few of Team Avatar and deciding what team best suits them. There is one catch. All of them are going to have at least one legendary. But they're also going to have a couple typage, maybe 3, depending on who it is. So you know what it is. Without further ado, let's start with the first person. So to start it off, we've got the Avatar, Aang. So Aang was born 100 years before the start of the series. He's considered to be one of the most powerful benders in the series. He has lost before, but the fact that he knows airbending and no one knows how to fight airbenders anymore makes him extremely powerful. So because he's the legendary Avatar, most of his team are legendary. So to start it off, we've got Silverly. So Silverly is kind of like the Avatar, where he can utilize every typage, whereas the Avatar can utilize every element of bending. So I have him with his flying memory on, because he is representation of the Avatar, and in this instance the Avatar is Aang, which is an airbender. Yeah, and that's literally it. And then I went with Articuno. Articuno is a ice flying type. I threw him on this team to symbolize the water bending, because a lot of water bending is also ice bending. They utilize water, ice, sweat. At one point they utilize blood. Basically all liquids can be utilized in water bending, or even ones that are frozen. So I have Articuno because Articuno is like one of the only ice flying legendaries. But moving on, we've got Landorus. So I went with Landorus because he is one of the few earth flying type in general, not just legendaries. He's one of the few ground flying types in general. Earth is one of the bending disciplines, which kind of makes this interesting. Yeah, that's really it. But I went with the 4-legged version because the original earthbenders in Avatar are badger moles, which are primarily 4-legged creatures. So I went with the 4-legged version instead of anything else. And then I went with Ho-Oh, primarily because Ho-Oh is considered one of the most powerful fire legendaries, especially when he was introduced. We had Moltres and Entei, but Ho-Oh kind of was... Ho-Oh was the most powerful fire legendary at the time. Because I think base stats, Moltres only has 570 or something like that, and Entei doesn't have much more than that. But Ho-Oh has like 7 something, I believe. But then moving on, I chose Passimian. Passimian because they get a little companion called Momo. He's a little flying lemur. And Passimian is supposed to be based off of a black-tailed lemur, I believe. So that's the only reason I went with Passimian. But Momo is one of the last of his kind, which the flying lemurs lived in the air temples. But unfortunately, flying lemurs, flying bison, and the air nomads were all wiped out 100 years ago by the Fire Nation. And then I went with Bofalent because Bofalent looks the most like Appa, which is a flying bison. He's also he's a buffalo, but he's also the closest thing to a bison Pokemon, other than like Tauros. But I didn't want to go with Tauros because Bofalent looks more like Appa than Tauros does. So that's why I went with him. And I think that concludes this team. So we're going to move on. Alright, so for team number 2, we've got Katara, which is the first waterbender you meet in the series. Which is also, ironically, the love interest of Aang, the Avatar. They end up having, I think, 3 children: a waterbender, a airbender, and then a non-bender. But without further ado, this is Katara's team. I went with Lapras because Lapras is often seen as a more feminine water Pokemon. But it's also water and ice, which is kind of what I was going for with her team. So that's essentially what I did. And then I've got Inteleon and Blastoise. They're on this team because they are water starters. And I basically went with them because they are starter Pokemon, and the Avatar team starts with Katara. Yeah, I thought way too much into that, not gonna lie. But moving on, we've got Cloyster. Cloyster, mostly because it is another water ice type. And really no other reason, not gonna lie. And then I went with Vaporeon because it's an evolution, and evolutions are freaking amazing, so fuck you. And then I went with Lunala. Lunala is only because it is representation of the moon, which in Avatar is the original bender. So I went with Lunala. And literally that is the only reason. Lunala represents the moon. Whereas Solgaleo represents the sun, obviously. And in Avatar, the moon is the original waterbender. And that's how humans learned how to waterbend. They watched the moon pull the tides and whatnot. So on that note, that is all for this team. So now we're gonna move on. So for this next team, I decided to go with Toph. So for Toph, obviously I went with Steel, Rock, and Ground. 3 elements rather than than everyone else, which has pretty much 2. I believe everyone else has 2, aside from Toph, other than Aang, who has various elements. Primarily like 4. He's primarily a flying, but yeah. So with hers, for these first 3, I went with, I actually did it as a inside joke. For those who don't remember, Toph and everyone else went to a play about themselves. And in it, Toph was a buff female character that was portrayed by a man. So that's why I went with these first 3, aside from the fact that they're 2 of the 3 elements. Rhyperior is a rock ground, Aggron is a rock steel, and then Steelix is a ground steel. So I went with these 3 because it's kind of an inside joke to that. But then I went with Excadrill because Excadrill kind of represents like a mole-like creature. And the original Earthbenders were badger moles. And obviously Excadrill is also a steel ground type. And then Sandslash also represents kind of like a mole-like creature, which is why I went with him, aside from the fact that he's also a steel type. Now, a whole lot of people think of Sandslash as a steel type, but I went with a lowland Sandslash, obviously. And then the legendary for her team is Groudon. Groudon I went with because he's kind of the embodiment of the Earth. He does learn a lot of like solar-esque abilities, but ultimately he represents the Earth itself. But that being said, let's move on to the next team. For the 4th team, I decided to go with Zuko. So Zuko is one of the final ones to join Team Avatar as the firebending master that ends up training the Avatar in firebending. So for his team, I decided to go with fire and electric. Being as lightning bending is very much so a thing in theirs. So, without further ado, I went with mostly dog-like Pokemon because he is definitely the loyal dog. He was loyal to his father, even though his father was abusive. Physically and mentally, which made it really hard for him to get over his father's shit. So I went with Flareon, Jolteon, Ninetales, Manectric, and Arcanine, all for that reason. Mix and match of dog, fire type, and electric type. And then for the legendary, I decided to go with Rayquaza because the original firebenders in this were dragons, and you actually see a couple of dragons even though they're thought to be extinct, just like flying bison are thought to be extinct. But you end up seeing a couple dragons, which is why I went with Rayquaza instead of any other dragon legendary, because Rayquaza mostly symbolizes their form, because they're more Asian-like in their appearance. So I went with Rayquaza. There's not a whole lot to explain with Zuko's. It's very cut and dry. He's a loyal dog, so I went with the entire dog team, and they're fire and electric, and then the dragon is the original firebenders. Yeah, let's move on to the fifth and final team. Alright, for this last one, I went with Sokka. So Sokka is the brother of Katara, and he's one of the only non-benders that associates with Team Avatar. So for him, I went with Steel and Fighting type, because he uses weapons. Eventually, he actually finds a master that teaches him sword fighting. So he knows sword fighting. He's learned how to basically dance and fight through one of his previous encounters. And his favorite weapon is his boomerang, which he loses at one point and then gets it back. But without further ado, this is the team I went with. So Lucario is the embodiment of fighting and steel. He utilizes both. And I feel like Lucario is a very prideful fighting type, and Sokka is a very prideful person. And then Aegislash literally looks like a sword. So obviously I was going to go with Aegislash. Sirfetch'd is holding a javelin and a shield, which is why I went with him. Poliwrath has a little bit more meaning behind it. So Poliwrath is a water fighting type, which is why I went with him, because he's part of the water tribe, just like Katara is. Making him essentially born of waterbenders, quote unquote. So the whole water type kind of makes him the embodiment of what Sokka is, a fighter as well as water tribe. And then I went with Blaziken. Blaziken, for a couple reasons. One, he's a starter type, and Sokka is one of the starters of Team Avatar. And then he's also a fire type, which his sword fighting master was part of the fire tribe. Well, the Fire Nation. Which coincides with the fire typage of Blaziken, and then also he's a fighter, obviously. And then I went with Cobalion as the legendary, because he's literally, he learns a lot of sword-like moves, being one of the swords of justice. He's also a steel fighting type. But yeah, that's about it for this video. Remember, if you like this content, like, comment, and subscribe. Also, comment down below what other series you'd like me to make teams for, and I'll make a team for them. So yeah, that's about it. Go follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/LordWeebius, and I'd love to see you there, and here, and everywhere, really. Yeah, that's about it. I'll see y'all next time.